Hi, everybody, and welcome. I'm Siobhan Carroll from Enterprise Health, and I'm the host for today's HITRUST webinar. Thank you for joining us. Today's webinar will focus on HITRUST scoping, what you need to know to successfully scope your project. The webinar itself will take about 45 minutes, leaving 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. I wanted to go over a couple of quick webinar tips. Throughout the webinar, we'll keep all lines muted to prevent background sounds. And if you need to get in touch with me, please use the chat feature, which is at the bottom middle of your screen. If you have questions that you'd like the presenters to address, please chat them to me whenever you think of them, and we will have them address them at the end of the webinar. After today's session, you'll receive an email from us. If you're interested in a copy of the slides, please let me know. For those of you who don't know, Enterprise Health is a healthcare-focused cybersecurity firm. We are one of the longest tenured certified HITRUST assessors with extensive experience in the NIST cybersecurity framework. We hold 2 seats on the HITRUST Assessor Council and 1 seat on HITRUST's Quality Assurance Subcommittee. We provide a range of cybersecurity services as well as Protect, which is a third-party risk management software platform. I'd like to introduce today's presenters. Ryan Patrick is the head of our HITRUST practice, and Brian Parks is the head of our security services practice. And for today's webinar, we'll be playing the part of a company going through the scoping practice. Ryan has over 17 years of healthcare IT and security experience across multiple security frameworks. He's a cybersecurity expert and brings innovative perspective to protecting information and organizational resources, having worked as a security analyst at both MetLife and Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Ryan has been battalion commander at the United States Army Reserve since April 2017. His previous military assignments include serving as Global Enterprise Operations Center Team Chief for U.S. Special Operations, Chief Information Officer of the 42nd Infantry Division within the New York Army National Guard, and as Deputy Chief Information Officer and Chief Information Officer of FEMA Region 2 Homeland Response Force. Brian Parks is a seasoned cybersecurity and risk management leader with over 30 years of security technology and healthcare experience. His deep knowledge of security frameworks, standards, implementation methodologies, technology platforms, organizational processes, and budget management has helped organizations improve and mature their security posture while mitigating risk and achieving regulatory compliance and security certification. Thank you both for joining us today. And Ryan, why don't you take it from here?
Thanks, Ron. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Just to go over an agenda real quick. What I want to do is, knowing that the topic is really about scoping, I want to just really quickly set the stage on what is HITRUST, just so we have a really clear understanding and a kind of a foundation of what HITRUST is before we jump into scoping. And I want to thank my partner in crime, Brian Parks, for joining me on today's call. I don't get to do a co-presentation with Brian very often. Actually, I think this may be our first one. So Brian, I want to say thanks publicly for joining me here. I have a feeling we're going to have a pretty good time on this one. So we're going to jump into kind of real quick of what HITRUST is, what it looks like, and then we'll get into the scoping fundamentals. What does HITRUST certify? Who sets the scopes? We'll talk about carve outs. What is a carve out? Does HITRUST allow carve outs? What are objects? What and why am I doing this? And then what we're actually going to dive into is the actual MyCSF platform. So you're going to get a live look at the web-based portal that you'll actually do the assessment in. So you'll get a look and feel for what it actually, what it feels like to drive it. And then we'll actually go through a live scoping exercise where Brian will act as an assessed organization. So the typical questions that we as an assessor firm would ask a client or someone who's looking to get certified to help kind of frame, how the scoping works, because, and I'm probably going to repeat myself several times throughout this presentation, you're going to hear me say things like scoping is the most important portion of getting certified or adopting the HITRUST CSF or methodology. You're going to hear me say things like HITRUST is a significant emotional event. Brian's probably, snickering on mute right now. Everybody I work with who may or may not be on the call right now, they've heard me say these things countless times. There's a reason for it, because we've been doing this for a long time. Enterprise has. We've learned lots of lessons, some hard, some not so hard. We're trying to impart our knowledge and our experience on you all. So I really encourage everybody to share your questions with the group through the chat function. As you're sharing those questions, Brian's going to be monitoring that. If they're relevant to what we're talking about in the moment, then we'll bring them out, and we'll try to answer them as they're relevant to the conversation. If we don't get to them in the conversation in the moment, we're going to set some time aside at the end to cover those questions. But the reason why we've kind of focused on just scoping is twofold. One, as I mentioned, it's the most important part of getting certified. But two, it's really hard. It is really, really complicated, and it's really, really confusing. So we wanted to provide a forum for folks to answer or ask questions to get the answers that they need to do all the right things and make sure their assessments are scoped properly. So that's what we're trying to do today. Normally, we try to cover scoping along with the entire certification journey, and it kind of gets lost and people don't necessarily get their questions answered. So that's what we're doing here today. So what are some of the benefits of the HITRUST CSF? I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on these because, again, we're kind of assuming that some people or everybody has come to this webinar with a little bit of a base, but I just want to lightly touch on it. It's really in depth. The CSF itself covers the entire organization from a certification perspective. This is not in IT or a security or privacy certification. This is, and this is going to sound somewhat counterintuitive when I get into a future slide. This certification is an organizational certification, meaning that it's going to touch every part of your organization. So when you get certified through HITRUST, it is going to touch every aspect of your organization. It's going to require a cultural change within the organization. So it's not just IT or security that are going to need to make changes on systems. The organization is going to need to change. So you're going to need that senior leadership, that executive level buy-in for it to be successful. It's a great way to demonstrate organizational commitment to managing risk, improving your security posture, and certain compliance activities, especially privacy. It's a great way to demonstrate to cybersecurity insurance companies that you're doing all the right things. We're seeing a lot in the market that a HITRUST report is pretty much all you need at this point to demonstrate not only to insurance companies, but other business partners that your security and privacy program are to a certain level of maturity to do business or to get insurance and things of that nature. It also obviously is a way of reducing organizational risk. Through the process itself, I don't want to necessarily tell you that it's going to prevent a breach. That would be relatively naive, and for anybody who's a security expert out there, you would see right through me. I can't guarantee it's going to prevent a breach. What I can tell you is that if you go through the certification process and you adopt the CSF as your framework, you are going to be thinking about the framework, and you will have adopted the framework and be working with it every single day, that you are likely going to identify gaps in your security and privacy program where you will close those gaps probably quicker than if you were not to use something like the CSF. So you probably will reduce your exposure to a breach than if you were not to have something like the HITRUST CSF. And the great thing about the HITRUST CSF in comparison to other frameworks or other Standards is a lot of the other ones are kind of one and done. Your SOC 2s and things of that nature. Someone comes in, they do their assessment on you, they issue your report, you kind of forget about it until the next year. Well, with HITRUST, there's kind of a forcing function in there where you're thinking about it all year long, and you're going to have to be doing something about it all year long in order to maintain the certification. So that's where the benefit really comes into it, and we can talk about what that means in future slides. So our personal partnership with HITRUST, Siobhan talked about this a little bit. We have several seats on different councils. I personally have a pretty good relationship with HITRUST. I talk to the folks at HITRUST just about every day, if not every day. I get phone calls and text messages all hours of the night from HITRUST. And what does that mean, really? It just means that we're tightly integrated with them. Not that they ever go lightly on us and don't hold us to the standard, because they definitely do. It just means that they're coming to us to pass ideas about changes to the CSF. We're giving them feedback on the CSF and anything that they're looking to do in the future. And that's kind of a two-way street. But we also get to present with them. I've done a lot of presentations with different people within HITRUST. So that partnership is really, really working, I think, mutually between both organizations. We actually are going to be able to get a look at the next version that's coming out, 10.x at this point, which is supposed to come out early next year, probably late Q1, early Q2 is what it's projected right now. So we're going to get an early look at that. It gives us some insight into what that's going to look like and how it's going to impact not only our current clients, but for future clients. So very interesting stuff. Helps us make sure that our methodology and the people that we're working with are all on the right track. So touching on this a little bit, I kind of outlined what this means to you all. Looking at the numbers here, 81% of US hospitals and health systems, 80% of US health plans have used the HITRUST CSF or the assurance program in some way, shape, or form. It's healthcare focused, but as of late, probably in the last 12 months or so, HITRUST is now becoming industry agnostic, which is a good thing. For those of you in the audience that are healthcare organizations, don't fret. They're not forgetting their roots. It is still healthcare focused, but what they're doing is they're actually branching out into other industries, which will only strengthen the framework because it'll become more widely accepted. So if you're a healthcare organization and you're trying to do business with another business partner who may not be familiar with healthcare, now that business partner will understand what HITRUST is because that's accepted in their industry now. It's known in their industry. If you're not a healthcare organization and you're starting to learn about HITRUST, that's the whole point, is that this is becoming a industry agnostic framework. And the whole goal is for this framework to kind of be a level set where, and their term is assess once, report many. So instead of having spreadsheet after spreadsheet or Word document after Word document coming through your door of your business partners or your clients saying, hey, fill this out so I know where your security or privacy program is. You just say, here's my HITRUST certification or my HITRUST report. You can hand that out multiple times so you're done filling out spreadsheets. What I like about HITRUST mostly is the scalability of it. So it really scales all types of organizations. So my favorite case study is we have a client that is literally a husband and wife organization, and we got them HITRUST certified. So a two-person organization is HITRUST certified. We also have multi-billion-dollar organizations that we work with that are HITRUST certified. So big companies, small companies, everybody can be HITRUST certified. The other thing that's scalable is that HITRUST doesn't expect you to be perfect. So you don't have to have perfect scores in order to get certified. That's unrealistic, because you could have perfect scores today. Your environment's going to change tomorrow, because that's what happens in IT. That's what happens in business. So what's the point of perfect scores today? So what the CSF looks for is for you to be able to manage your risk and manage the requirements or the controls that you have in place, and assess them and manage them to make sure that you're doing everything you can to close those gaps. And oh, by the way, continue to assess them and close those gaps. So you don't have to get 100% on every single requirement in every single domain across the board. So we can talk about that a little bit if we want to get into scoring, if anybody has any questions. Not specifically what we're here to talk about today, but if anybody has any questions and we have a little bit of time, we can definitely jump into that. So I promise we're going to get into scoping here in a second. This is the last slide where we're going to kind of set the table for scoping. These are kind of the 4 phases that Enterprise Health sets or defines for the HITRUST certification lifecycle. Starts with scoping, as I mentioned, the most important step to get certified. So the first thing that we do is scope the assessment itself. So what are we trying to scope? Well, if you get that wrong up front, you could get all the way to phase 3, which is remediation, and realize, oh no, I've got this scoped all wrong, and have to go all the way back to phase 2, which, as you can imagine, depending on how long you're in phase 2 and 3, that could be 6 or 9 months worth of work. Now you're backtracking and you may have to redo work. So getting scoping right up front is absolutely critical. So the biggest thing to consider is you don't want to overscope, meaning you don't want to include so much that it takes you forever to get through the whole process, meaning you've included too much and it's unnecessary, or underscope where you haven't included enough and the whole reason for you to get certified has not been served. So if you, let's say you have a contractual obligation to get 3 systems certified because you want to do business with, organization X. Organization X wants to use these 3 systems, but you only scope 2 of them. Well, now you've underscoped that assessment. So that's why scoping becomes so critical, and making sure you get it right up front, because again, if you get it wrong, time is money. Time is wasted effort on your organization and your people, their efforts to get through this whole process. So we start off with scoping. We spend a very considerable amount of time, at least I would say, compared to some others in the business, where we dig into your business, your business drivers, understanding how your business operates, because all that matters. All of that determines what the scope is going to be. Sometimes it's really clear. Sometimes it's not so clear. I have a client right now that I have probably had, probably 5 or 6 different scoping sessions with, because they have a very unique and complex business model, and it's not really cut and dry. And oh, by the way, they have very specific business drivers for wanting to get certified. So we've had to have multiple iterations to make sure that the scope is exactly what they need it to be. So once the scope is defined, the assessment is actually generated, and then we go into phase 2. Phase 2 is what's called the readiness assessment. This whole assessment is where we benchmark your organization, see where you're at against the CSF. So as an output of the scoping is your assessment's generated. There's going to be a number of requirements in my CSF that are spit out. The average assessment's probably around 400 requirements, anywhere, I usually say anywhere between 3 to 450 requirements is average. Based on that, you're gonna have to assess yourself against that number of requirements. Let's just say 400. 5 levels of maturity. You're gonna score yourself. You're gonna implement, or you're gonna write comments, and you're gonna provide evidence based on those 5 levels of maturity for each one of those 400 requirements in phase 2. Once that's done, at least from an enterprise perspective, we're gonna review your assessment, and we're gonna tell you and score you and say, hey, here's where you're doing really well. Here are where your gaps are. And where your gaps are, this is what we suggest you do to get to a certifying state. We review that with you. We work with you and send you into phase 3. And that's when remediation begins. And truthfully, remediation is kind of the long pole in the tent. And one of the reasons why I'm super excited to have my work battle buddy, my partner Foxhole, Brian Parks on the line, because I'm actually not allowed by HITRUST rules to do any of your remediation work, because it's kind of the fox watching the hen house. So my team is not allowed to help you during remediation, but Brian's team can from an enterprise perspective. So I'm gonna actually toss it over to Brian, and he can walk you through kind of what that remediation phase looks like and how his team kind of tackles remediation, and talk about some of those timelines. So Brian, if you wouldn't mind taking it over.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ryan. So once you get through the assessment and you understand where those gaps are, as Ryan said, that moves you into remediation. You'll need to achieve certain scores in order to pass the next phase of validation and actually, eventually get your certification. And so you want to make sure that you are as thorough as possible during that remediation phase. Now, what does remediation mean? Well, policy and process, for example, you will assess yourselves during that phase 2 self-assessment or readiness assessment. And then Ryan's team, the HITRUST assessors, will tell you where you stand with it. Once you get to remediation, you know those gaps, and oh, I have to go back and I have to either create new policies and processes, which some may not exist in your organization, or I have to update what I have to close those gaps. Now, I'm going to ask this question of Ryan for the other phases, but I can tell you that you need to be prepared for remediation. When we scope a remediation project, which is outside of the entire HITRUST project that Ryan's team runs, we will typically see anywhere from 400 to 600 person hours required to do the remediation. And that includes writing those policy and process statements to adhere to the requirements from your assessment. It will include uploading all of that information to the portal. And Ryan mentioned responses. There are responses in the assessment phase. There are also responses in the remediation phase. And so you have to get all of that up into the portal so that you can move on to that next phase of validation. And what I just mentioned there does not include evidence. You need to provide evidence for each one of those requirements to show that your organization does in fact practice what you preach, so to speak. And that can be screenshots of syslogs. It can be screenshots of physical wireless adapters that you have in your office. It can be, screenshots of other physical, fire extinguishers, things like that. And I just caution to not underestimate the time that it takes to actually go through that. As I said, we typically scope it to be between 400 and 600 hours. So that's just for the remediation. And Ryan talks about significant emotional event, one of his favorite terms when we talk about HITRUST, and that speaks to the magnitude of remediation. But Ryan, maybe, phases 1, 2, and 4, maybe you can give us an example or a sense of what the organization can expect for their resources, for their folks in terms of effort to get through those other phases.
Yeah, it's a great question. So phase 1, there's not a lot of labor on the assessed organization's behalf. It's mostly going to be conversational. You can expect to demonstrate or provide, is probably a better word, network diagrams, data flow diagrams, things like that. It's much more conversational. And you'll see when we get into the scoping exercises, some of the questions that I'll be asking Brian, mostly around business drivers and what's bringing the organization to want to get HITRUST certified. And you're going to see that I constantly, that's probably the biggest question that I ask folks when doing scoping is, why are we here? And reminding them of the systems that we want to put in scope. That lens of the systems that are in scope is something that I consistently remind people, because it's really easy and again, when we get into the scoping, it's really easy to say, I want to have system number 1 in scope. And then when we get into the actual scoping, where we start answering questions, which drives the number of requirements, to then think about the whole organization. Let's say you have 4 systems total in your organization. And let's say we're talking about number of records held. Well, system number 1 may only have, I don't know, let's say 100,000 records held, but the whole organization may have 1 million. Well, we only care about that 100,000, not the million. So you'll see when we get into that what I mean. So scoping, it's not a heavy lift for the assessed organization. Phase 2 is it's probably a bit more. You're probably going to spend people hours. You'll probably spend, probably a good couple hundred people hours, and that'll be spread out across a number of different people. Like I said, this is an organizational assessment. So your HR people, you're going to have facilities people, privacy people, legal, IT, security. When we get into another slide, you'll see, I think it's an upcoming slide. You'll see the 19 domains. You'll see the titles of those domains. You're going to see kind of the different roles and responsibilities that it covers. So there's definitely a couple hundred hours worth of work there. The evidence generation is probably the biggest lift, because you're going to have to provide documentation, screenshots of, number of different things. When you get into validation, the way that we work it, validation is mostly on us, meaning the assessor firm. We've already collected or had you collect or send to us the majority of the stuff we need. We're doing the majority of the work there. So your level of effort probably is less than 100 people hours at that point, where our level of effort kind of skyrockets at that point. Okay, so I'm going to just breeze through this really quickly, because I want to get into the scoping slides. This is the slide I was just mentioning. I just want to point out domain 1, information security program. That is going to be very heavy on your security officer. Talking about the security program, it's going to have a lot of senior management type of stuff. Is your senior executive leadership doing their part to support the information security program? I want to point out third-party management. That could really spread out to a number of different people within the organization. Look at domain 18, your physical environmental protection. That could be facilities people. If you have a hosted environment, you're working in the cloud, that may be some people who are not even a part of your organization. So then you have, there's HR in here in a lot of different places. Domain 11, there's going to be lots of HR stuff in there for access control. There's a number of different hiring and termination procedures. So there's a lot of different types of organizational departments that are covered in these 19 domains. All right, so let's get into some really heavy scoping. And Brian, keep me honest on any of the questions that pop up. So what does HITRUST actually certify? What they don't certify are organizations. You hear a lot that, you know, enterprise health is HITRUST certified. It's kind of a misnomer, because enterprise health isn't certified, but you know, Protect, which is a software platform that enterprise health has, is HITRUST certified. So what it doesn't certify are really organizations, people, products, or services. What it does certify, and it really only certifies, is implemented systems. So if you have a system that's currently in development, it can't be certified. Now, does that mean you have to wait to get your HITRUST journey started? Absolutely not. I actually highly encourage you, if you're in development, right now is when you should start your HITRUST journey. Because what you don't want to have happen is you come out of development, you go into production, you start your HITRUST journey, and then you realize there's all these things that you could have fixed while you were in development that now you have to go back and fix. So if you can have the answers to the test while you're in development, let's fix it while you're in development. So just, you know, best practice, if you can start your journey now, get that assessment object created, see what technical parameters, so to speak, any policies and procedures that need to be put in place for that system while it's still in development. Let's work on that now. We have several clients right now that are in development for products that they're going to go to market next year in 2021. And they've been working on it since the beginning of 2020. So there's nothing saying that you have to wait. Actually, and now I'm being a little redundant, but I'm trying to foot stomp this, that being in development should not preclude you from starting your journey. It's the exact opposite. But I want to make sure people understand it's only implemented systems. So
and Ryan, real quickly, does that mean that specific versions of the systems are certified, or is it, you know, across versions? That was a question that just came in. I thought was relevant right now.
That's a great question. So not necessarily. If it's a major change, and we have to assess each change on a case by case, whether it voids, so to speak, and I don't want to use the term void as a definitive term. Whether it requires a recertification is probably a better way of saying it. If a major change requires a recertification, needs to be handled on a case by case. Generally, the answer is not necessarily if you change versions. So I guess let me think about an example. Thinking about, like, if you get certified and you change your identity management system for that system, for that certified system, that may be a large enough change that you may have to get recertified. But if you've only changed, you know, one module that has nothing to do with, from a security perspective, or has no security impacts, then it likely will not require a recertification. You can go right into your interim without issue.
Perfect, thanks.
All right, so here's a big question that I think most people don't understand. Most people who come to enterprise and we start scoping, they think, oh, well, HITRUST is going to tell me what my scope should be. It's the exact opposite. You have all the power in the world as the assessed organization. You set the scope. HITRUST nor the assessing firm, meaning someone like Enterprise, can tell you what your scope is going to be. What someone like Enterprise can do is guide you and give you advice on what the scope should be based on what they've seen HITRUST push back on, because HITRUST isn't going to tell you, well, you left, X, Y, and Z out. We know that's in your environment. HITRUST doesn't know what's in your environment. They're not going to tell you that, system Y over there should be in scope. That's not their business. You don't need that certified. You just want system X certified. But if system X is certified, they're going to expect to see all of system X in scope. And that leads into the next slide, which talks about carve outs. But that's the only time they'll really push back, is if there's something that should be in scope that you've excluded or carved out, that they'll push back on. But otherwise, you have all the power in the world to say, this is what I want to have in scope. So thinking about that, this goes back to my comments earlier. What are your business drivers? Who are you doing business with? Are you in the cloud? Are you co-load? What related systems are interfacing with that system that you want to get certified? Those are the types of questions you should be asking yourself. And with your assessor firm, you'll be able to define that scope. And that lends itself to a question that I'm often asked in these presentations, is when you should bring an assessor firm in. And it's going to sound very self-serving considering I work for an assessor firm, but the sooner the better. The earlier you can get an assessor firm in, the better it's going to be, because as I've mentioned, scoping is the most important. If you get it wrong up front, it's going to cause pain later. If you miss scope on your own, then when you actually need the assessor firm, which is in what I've defined as phase 4, which is at the end of the process, you could be in for a big surprise just before certification. So I would recommend getting an assessor firm in as soon as possible.
And Ryan, as you go to carve outs, and I think you've answered the question, but another question came in that's relevant here, and it talks about PCI DSS, cardholder data, and about them having hard requirements for scoping. So if you as an organization select your scope, which kind of means it's flexible, then how does a HITRUST certification ensure that all PHI is similarly being secured?
That is a great question. So understanding that HITRUST was born out of healthcare, HITRUST only certifies what's in scope. HITRUST is not like PCI or like the HIPAA security rule, where they've made, in those examples, they've made credit card data and PHI, respectively, the center of gravity. HITRUST isn't saying PHI is the center of gravity. What they've said is whatever is in scope is the center of gravity. So the sensitive data and the system in scope for where that sensitive data is the center of gravity. So it's not necessarily PHI in that organization that HITRUST cares about. HITRUST cares about the sensitive data and the controls of that system are in place.
Great, yep.
So carve outs. I kind of alluded to this, so I'll spend another second on it. So HITRUST does not allow for carve outs. So in that scenario where we were talking about, let's say you have some kind of middleware in one of your systems that you want to put in scope, you cannot carve out the middleware if data is flowing through that middleware. Because let's say it's hosted in an environment that you don't control. You can't carve it out because you feel like you can't pass because it's there. HITRUST doesn't allow for that. You either own it or it's either in the system or it's not. So you have to consider those things. You have to, I hate to use this phrase, you have to either own it or not own it, meaning it's either all or nothing from that perspective. Now, you don't have to put everything in your environment in scope, but if you choose a system, that system, for the most part, has to be in scope. Carve Outs is a little, it's not as cut and dry as I kind of made it. There is nuance to it. And I'm happy to set up individual discussions with people after this webinar. Just reach out to Siobhan or the point of contact at the end of the slides. We can set up individual follow-up scoping or question Q&A sessions, because again, like I said, scoping is really, really tough and the devil's in the details. So if you have specific questions, especially around carve outs, I'm happy to answer those because I really, really, really need the details to give you definitive answers. Okay, this slide goes to everything I've kind of been saying at this point. What am I doing? Why am I doing this? The biggest driver is what has brought you to this need? Is it something contractual? Is there someone who's saying you need to get HITRUST certified? For healthcare folks out there, is there a big payer that's saying you need to get HITRUST certified? Is there something regulatory that's saying that you need to be HITRUST certified? Is it due to competitive advantage? Is it just because you want to be better from a security and privacy perspective? These things matter, especially from a contractual perspective. If you have a contractual obligation, there's probably timelines attached to that. Those timelines matter, especially when it comes to when you're going to get started. Because if you wait, it's going to be harder and harder and harder to actually get certified. So the moment you sign that contract, you need to get started now on the path to getting started. Don't wait a month. Don't wait 15 days. Start talking to an assessor firm. Start down the path, because every week, every day matters. If you think you're going to get certified in 6 months or less, I'm telling you right now, you have unrealistic expectations. And I mean that with all of the positive energy I could possibly send through this computer. It's just unrealistic because there are several windows that have to be observed per HITRUST rules. That 6 months is just not enough time. You would have to be the most amazing, mature security and privacy organization on the planet. And I have yet to see that organization. And I've been doing this since 2013. So again, I'm happy to be surprised, but I'm telling you, less than 6 months is really hard. Less than 9 months is really hard. 12 months is normally the expectation we set with folks. Keep in mind, you have to understand why you're doing this. We have some clients that are required by their respective states to get HITRUST certified. Understanding those drivers really, really will help drive your scope. So Brian, I'll pause there, see if there's any questions that came in while I set up the actual My CSF.
No, as you're going in there, I think you've covered most of the questions that we have, that we've seen. Is there, as you're going in there, is there like any impact on things like cybersecurity insurance? Like how do they, do insurance companies view a HITRUST certification in a positive light and, maybe reduce cost, anything like that?
Yeah, so all the feedback that I've gotten is it's a good indicator to the insurance companies that you're doing everything that you need to do. I personally have not submitted to an insurance company because I've been on the consulting side for many years, but the insurance companies just want to know that you're improving, and ultimately the real value. And I give credit to one of our peers in Enterprise. is the real value, and he says this a lot, is in the actual corrective action plans. That's what they really want to see. They want to see that you're opening and closing corrective action plans. But the report itself, plus those corrective action plans, I think are what they are looking for year over year when you're renewing those policies.
Great.
Can you see my CSF, Brian?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So just as a reminder, Brian is going to play the client. He's going to, we're going to kind of breeze through the organizational info. This is actually my CSF. This is a live version of my CSF. This is just a demo object that we created for Enterprise Health. So we're going to go through the organizational info. We're not going to really enter any information here, but I'm going to just walk through some of these factors. These 6 links right here basically is the entire scoping for generating an assessment. And on the back end is where we'll actually get to see the number of requirements generated, and then we can click into the individual domains and just see how they fall out into the individual domains. And then based on how that pans out, we can see if there's any follow-up questions, and if there's anything we want to change in the factors to see how it affects the number of requirements, we can do that as well. So the organizational information, very straightforward, nothing really tricky there. We'll jump to assessment options. So the first question is asking whether you're going to submit it to HITRUST for report processing. Pretty straightforward stuff. Again, is this going to be a CSF assessment or targeted assessment? Very straightforward. Doesn't really have much of a bearing one way or the other. This one is pretty critical, actually. 2 options: only controls required for certification, or all CSF controls. All CSF controls basically is going to increase the number of requirements pretty significantly. Only controls required for certification is only going to generate the number of controls, as it says, required for certification. So if you think about the hierarchy within the CSF, when we go into the domains, there are going to be requirements. Those requirements fall under the CSF security controls. So there's 135 security controls. I believe only the controls required for certification is somewhere in the 70s. Don't quote me on the total number. I don't have that off the top of my head. So you can see really quickly how that would change an assessment with total number of requirements. So we generally recommend to our clients, especially first-time certifiers, only do the controls required for certification. Because if you do all CSF controls, your average assessment will go from 300 to 400 to probably something over 500, just like that, even if you don't put any of the other factors on the high side.
And Ryan, how does that compare to I mean, we know that there are a total library of like 1,900 or so controls. So you're just talking, this is specific to security controls?
Correct. So that lends itself to the next one, which are privacy controls. So these are just the security controls that are within the CSF. So the 1,900 requirements fall within those 135 controls. So think about it like a hierarchy. So if I click into the 135 controls individually, there's going to be 1,900 requirements under 135 controls.
Got it. Thank you.
So privacy controls. Keep in mind, if you look down here, domain 19 that I'm hovering over is all about privacy. Whether I pick yes or no, domain 19 is going to be there. So you're always going to have privacy controls. This is just going to increase those privacy controls probably by about 100. So it's not going to drastically increase, but you increase the assessment by 100, it's definitely going to increase your workload. I don't want to say significantly, but by a good amount. So again, first-time certifiers, we recommend no on this unless you're a very privacy-focused organization. Then obviously you're going to click yes. So then we come into systems. So a couple things to remember, Brian, when we're talking about systems. One, these are the systems that you're going to put in scope. This does not have to include every single system in your environment. This doesn't have to include Outlook. This doesn't have to include your security tools. This doesn't have to include any development tools unless they're pertinent to the scope, the systems that you need to have in scope to get certified. Think about the business drivers that have brought you here. So is there something that specifically brought you here that is driving you to get certified?
So in the interest of time, let me give you a quick overview of what I think a typical client might look at, and how they might answer, and you can fill it out as we go here if that works for you. For this example, let's say that we're a pretty large business associate. Our main product is a platform that's used by our customers for rev cycle, for example. And it is accessible to the internet, but it's only accessible, it's only for our clients. It's not available to the open public. So our main system would be this rev cycle platform that is cloud hosted, and it is open to the internet. But you can't just register and use it. You have to be a customer of ours, and we have to give you credentials to access the system.
Okay. All right. So for systems and facilities, I'm going to give you the lowdown. Anything you put on here, I'm going to test it. So if you only put one system on there, that's the only system I'm going to test. If you only put one facility on here, I'm going to test it. Same thing goes for the report. Anything you put on here are the only things you're going to have on the report. So if there's anything or any place that you want to have quote unquote certified, it needs to be here. So just keep that in the back of your mind. So going to the factors. Most important thing to remember about the factors. This is how HITRUST determines your organizational risk. So as we go through these questions, what they're doing is, if you look at number of records held, they assume that an organization with less than 10 million records held is less risky than an organization with more than 60 million records held. So if you choose less than 10 million, there's going to be less requirements generated based on this answer than if you choose more than 60 million. So as we go through these, this is what's going to generate your number of requirements. So service provider non-IT, I assume?
Correct.
Business associate?
Correct.
How many records?
Let's stick with less than 10 million.
Okay, just as a note, you kind of get to determine what number of records held means for those of you out in the audience. This is not necessarily patient records for you healthcare people. Again, with Brian, who is a rev cycle organization, it's very different for you than someone who is in EHR organization. So depending on your specific business, you kind of get to determine what those records mean. Geographic factors, state, multi-state, offshore.
We're multi-state, we're in the United States only.
Okay. Technical factors. So keep in mind that even if your system is not available via the internet, but your employees can remote to it via VPN, HITRUST considers that accessible from the internet.
And the answer is yes there.
Okay. Is the scope system on-prem or cloud-based, accessible by third parties?
I would say no to that. We do all of our development in-house, and it is available only to our customers.
Okay. This can be a key test in my typing.
And just keep in mind the time here.
Yeah. So then I assume you don't transmit with third parties.
Correct.
Publicly positioned, if you answered above here from the internet, I would say it's publicly positioned, correct?
And it is correct. Yeah, anybody can see that it's there, but not anybody can register.
Okay. Number of interfaces to other systems. Think about interfaces on a router or something like that.
Yeah, I believe fewer than 25 is appropriate here.
Okay. Number of users of the system. Fewer than 500, up to 5,500, greater than
Up to
5,500.
Up to 5,500.
Number of transactions per day.
We're probably, we're less than 85,000.
Okay. And keep in mind, just for those out there, this is just for his one in-scope system. So this is not his whole organization. Hosted in the cloud.
Yes, it is.
So if it's hosted in the cloud, does your cloud provider have access to this?
I'm not sure how to answer that question. So we have in Amazon Web Services, we have our own virtual private cloud. So I would say no, but AWS, I guess, technically could have access to anything.
Okay, I think that warrants probably a further discussion because we may have to define these two a little bit better. So just something for us to keep in mind.
Gotcha. You see, these are some of the nuances that you end up going through when you're scoping.
Right, exactly. And just so everybody out there keeps in mind, we're going through this relatively quickly for two reasons. One, this is not designed to be a really in-depth conversation, and two, we're running really short on time. But these are the types of discussions, as you can see, that we would be having to really dig into what the scope is driving towards. So I'm actually going to skip ahead because most of the next couple are pretty straightforward. Doesn't really need any specific discussion. I want to jump to the regulatory factors. So the important point to keep in mind with the regulatory factors, and I know we mentioned PCI earlier, is you are not required by anything or anyone to pick any one of these regulatory factors, even if you're subject to PCI or subject to Joint Commission or anything else. Because if you pick these, it does not satisfy any one of them. If you pick PCI, you're not going to end up PCI certified through this assessment. You're not going to become FSMA compliant, or you're not going to be able to take this and report to CMS with this report. You're still going to have you still have all those same reporting requirements, even if you select these and get the report on the back end. This whole purpose of this is just to be able to demonstrate compliance, whether those authoritative sources or those authoritative bodies accept that is up to them. I can't guarantee that. So just keep in mind that you don't have to pick these. So Brian, any of these that you're looking to select?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing here is that, while we are, let's say we're incorporated in Pennsylvania, as I mentioned, our system is available to multiple clients in the US. Specifically, when we get to the different states, let's say we do business in certain states that have some of these specific requirements, like Texas, I think Massachusetts might be one, if I'm not mistaken. Yes.
You have Massachusetts, Nevada.
Texas and Nevada. So let's say that we've got customers who are based there.
You have California, and then New York should be here somewhere.
There's And that's important because that will expose additional controls that are specific to the regulations in those states. Good.
Right. The HITRUST used to satisfy Texas Health and Safety Code. I'm not sure if it still does, to be honest. But okay, let's see how this one ends up. All right, so we have about 490 requirements based on those answers. So I know we're over time, a couple of minutes. I just want to do a check on questions.
Yeah, we've been answering kind of as we go.
Yeah, I think you're good on questions right now.
Yeah, there's one or two here that I think are probably best answered. You know, we can contact people directly. Somebody, I did have two questions, two similar questions here. One is, how is a transaction defined? How is a record defined? And I responded to one of those two questions and used the example of a single patient with multiple billing records and multiple diagnoses, codes, and records for a single medical condition. And all of those would be, you know, it could be potentially considered hundreds of records. And just check me on that answer.
Yeah, for the records, it really depends on what your system is doing and what the nature of it is. Again, happy to dig into that one-on-one. It could be patient records. I'm not sure the nature of the system in scope. It could be something as just the name of the person. It could be user count. I'm not sure.
Gotcha.
So the devil's kind of in the details on that one. As far as transactions, normally what I direct people on is database transactions. It doesn't have to be individual fields, but think about your transactions, you know, when you're posting to a database or anything like that. So if you're posting to multiple fields, that one single transaction, what are you doing in that? How many times are you making those types of commands?
Great.
Why don't we say that if we didn't answer someone's question, if they just want to email it to us, we will get back to them, you know, this week, so we can either set up time to talk, or we can just answer the question directly through email, whichever seems like a better option. Does that work?
Yeah, that's a great idea. I think as we wrap up, just one final question here that is pretty important, and it talks about changes in scope and how far, and you know, what are the major impacts of, you know, if you decide to change scope at some point after the assessment is generated. What are the impacts?
And again, I'm not struggling to answer the question. I'm just trying to. Siobhan, do you want to just close out? Anybody who has questions can just hang out. Is that better?
Oops. Yeah, I mean, people can drop off as they want to, but we probably should wrap it up and then have people send us questions.
Okay.
Don't do that. So if you're looking for a copy of the slides, please send me an email. We have some on this slide here. We have some information on our website, and you can go to our LinkedIn page where we update it with whenever we have a new webinar or anything like that. So I want to thank everybody for joining us, and hopefully we will talk to you all soon. Thanks.
So Joy and Bart, if you want to hang out, we can get your answers real quick, and then we'll cut it off at you two.
Okay. Do you want to answer Joy first?
Yeah. So Joy, we can you can make changes to the scope after it's the assessment's generated, really at any time. But what I want to caution you on is how far along in your journey you are. So if you're in the way I've defined it, and let me go back to the slide just so we're kind of speaking the same language. if you're, say, in phase 3, so you've already done your readiness assessment and you've decided you're going down a certain path of remediation and you're in remediation, you're already changing things. If you change your scoping and it changes your requirements, either makes them harder or removes requirements, you may find yourself either have already wasted time or you may have to redo work because the requirements are now harder. So there's different levels to the requirements themselves. There's levels 1, 2, and 3. So as you change, let's use the number of records held as an example. So Brian picked less than 10 million. Let's say you change that to over 60 million. Well, that's probably going to generate level 3 requirements, which are going to be harder and they're going to be more complex. So anything you've already remediated for those requirements, you're likely going to have to redo. So you can change it at any time. What I wouldn't do is change it in phase 4 because you're already validating. If you're having an assessor, they're probably going to tell you not to do that because it's going to be a huge waste of time and likely a waste of money. But if you're in remediation, it likely would be a waste of time and a waste of effort. So again, I'm not knowing where you are in your journey right now. The answer is yes, but just be aware that there could be second and third order effects. I hope that answers your question. Bart, so question about lifetime clinical records for a single patient. So assuming that the patient itself is the oh my God, I'm failing. Brian, help me. What's the term in a database for the key record in a database when you're doing relational databasing? Oh my God. Anyway, assuming that patient, the name of the patient is kind of the parent record, then I would just use that patient name as the single record. All the other information, think of that as just information under that patient record, because it all links back to that patient.
Yeah, and I was talking on mute there. I apologize. I was trying to help you out with that. What about so Ryan? This is something that is it's not always crystal clear. So let's imagine a patient with multiple billing records and multiple diagnoses for a single medical condition. And maybe that one you say, well, it's just one. It's the patient is the master record. But then what about, they across 2 or 3 years, they come back for different medical conditions. Is that still just one record in your mind?
I mean, as long as it's still being related back to that original record, meaning the original patient record, because it's still under that. I guess it would depend on how it's all being stored, meaning
Right.
like how is the EHR capturing that data?
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yep. So again, a little more discussion, a little more investigation needed for that level.
Like if that information is being captured, in one EHR, and then it's also in, whatever it may be, in the radiology system, and then somewhere else, then you could argue that they're individual records. But if it's clinical notes underneath the same record within the EHR, or it's all linked somehow, then it's one record in my mind. But again, that's why the devil's in the details. These are the types of questions we would be asking.
All right, do you think we're good for now? Yes, no, maybe?
Yeah, I
I'm
think
good if
we are.
Mark's good.
Okay, all right, thank you guys. I will we'll get everybody copies of the slides, and anybody who wants them. And thanks, Brian and Ryan. I appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
Okay, bye.